going to have a discussion this week about the material from chapter 20 and 21, which is on business cycles, one of my favorite subjects and one of my fields of study. To have a frame of reference for business cycles, we're going to rely on another equation, one that I introduced initially to you during the semester, but now we're going to dig into it deeper. And that's the equation of exchange. The equation of exchange is normally shown as MV equals PY. And as I've said before, when I introduce an equation to you, I expect you to know what the variables represent. So in this case, M stands for the money supply. V stands for the velocity of money, or how often money changes hands during a year. P equals the price level, and Y equals the quantity of produced goods. And so you can see that this equation, the money supply times velocity, is always going to equal the price times the quantity of goods that are purchased, because those represent demand and supply. So in other words, you could say that the left hand represents demand, the right hand is equal to supply, and therefore supply and demand are going to be equal, or this is the equilibrium state. Now, when we talk about business cycles, we're interested in them because they represent somewhat irregular fluctuations in the economy. I say somewhat irregular because they seem to have a pattern in that they occur about every 5 to 10 years. We have another one. And this has been going on for a very, very long time. I have a graphic that shows the economy from 1776 until 1944. And in this graphic, we see that, again, there were business cycles occurring at regular intervals, irregular but regular intervals, all the way up through 1944. And of course, since 1944, we've had them happening again, and we're about to we're heading into one right now as this class is taking place. At the beginning of the semester, I told you that we were going to be interested in studying the answers, or finding the answers, to 4 questions. One of those was, why do we have inflation? Another one was, why do we have unemployment? Another one was, why do we have sustained economic growth in some countries and not in others? And the last question was, why do we have business cycles? And I told you at the time that we normally refer to them as recessions. But in fact, the business cycles, as we're going to learn, depending on who is defining them, can be shown as upturn, downturn, upturn or downturn, downturn only, and then recovery. And so it can be a number of different things depending on who is trying to explain it. So we're going to look at all the different theories. In order to do this, there are some tools that we're going to need. And of course, the equation of exchange that I introduced to you is one of those. Another one that we're going to need is we're going to need to evaluate the aggregate supply and demand graph. And we'll be using that to consider the different theories. So unlike the microeconomic supply and demand curves, the aggregate supply and demand graph represents the entire economy. And so what we have here is we have a graph that has aggregate demand, which of course is the downward sloping representation of all the demand for the entire economy. We have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, which represents the aggregate of supply and providers in the entire economy. And we introduce one more element, which is what we call the long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical. And so you can think of the long run aggregate supply curve as the stock of supply. What is it that we have in terms of capabilities of producing? And that's fixed because at any point in time, we all have a certain number of people and a certain amount of resources. So there's only so much supply that we can produce in a perfect situation. Whereas the short run aggregate supply curve represents those things that we can produce in the short run, pushing in different directions in terms of what we want to produce. What can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift out? Well, one would be an increase in net exports. If we start selling more goods and services to other countries, the aggregate demand curve would shift out. Another would be government purchases. So if the government pulls money out of the loanable funds market and then spends that in the economy, that would increase aggregate demand. Another would be an increase in consumption on the part of the public, an increase in the population that's consuming. So a number of different things can cause that to happen. What could make the aggregate supply curve shift out? Well, the aggregate supply curve could shift out if we had increases in technology, new technology, or if we increased human capital through education and skills, or the discovery of additional natural resources. All of these things could cause the aggregate supply curve to shift out. Again, the short run supply curve is upward sloping and the long run supply curve is vertical.